Well, welcome to Round the Table with Christian Concern, live here today on Friday. And we're going to discuss today why we should challenge the government's proposals to ban so-called conversion therapy. It's great to be joined today by Andrea Williams, our Chief Executive at Christian Concern, and also by Caris Mosley, who is a policy researcher here at Christian Concern. Great to see you guys. I want to start, Andrea, just asking you, first of all, why is this important, this whole issue of conversion therapy, which can feel a bit esoteric and people watching might not know why it matters? What would you say to someone who says, why is it important that we engage with this consultation that the government is running now?
Because it's all about the gospel. It's all about saying people are free. It's all about saying people can change. And I love James Linton's comment here in many ways, starting us right off. Don't call it, he says, conversion therapy. Refer to it as Christ's message of love and repentance of sin and forgiveness. And of course, James has got it right there. And it's absolutely true that the other side that have in effect managed to so skew this discourse in terms of the language that we use. This whole term of conversion therapy, not defined by the government, but used continually in the public discourse, conjuring up something that's weird, cruel, and awful. When, in fact, what the effect of what the government is seeking to do here is to ban certain forms of therapy entirely, and furthermore, the ultimate repercussions of it is that it's going to really harm our freedom to, within churches, pastorally, to speak out the truth of, as James mentioned there, just the truth of what it really means to be turned around, transformed in and through the power of Jesus Christ. Pastoral conversations are at real risk. And that's why it's so important that we engage with what the government is doing here, that we help them to understand what the notion of what they are seeking to ban here, what it will really mean in effect. I think, James, I've been with you that we can't use the term conversion therapy because it's a term that's imposed upon us. It's a campaign term that the LGBT activists have used to skew and distort the conversation. But there comes a point whereby, in order to engage, in order to engage with a government consultation on conversion therapy, we have to sometimes use that term and then seek to expose why it's a term that just doesn't work or that can't be explained.
Yeah. And Caris, what's your perspective on this? Why do you think it's important that we respond to this consultation on it's not even a consultation on whether to ban conversion therapy, it's a consultation on how to ban conversion therapy, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you actually look at the text of the consultation, they ask a question that's not even the first question. So before they say these are the questions, they ask, are you in principle supportive or opposing the government's proposals? Which I think is, you do wonder what's going to happen to the responses. If we said we're opposed, are all those who oppose, are their responses going to be thrown in the bin at the beginning? I think that's very odd. I've never seen that really in a consultation before. So I mean, yeah, there are lots of games being played by this consultation, and this is why we've brought out this guide which helps supporters go carefully through and to explain to them what is going on, so that they can.
So if you're subscribed to our emails, you should have had a guide, action alert guide for responding to this conversation in your email box. If you're not subscribed to our emails, why not? You should get subscribed now, christianconcern.com/hello. Give us your email address and we'll get these things out to you on time. And
can I actually just jump in there, Tim, because of what I want to really, delve in on what Caris has said. I want to read the actual words. All right.
Go on.
And the government will ban conversion therapy. The government will ban it. Bear in mind that in a sense, everyone thinks they know what conversion therapy is when they don't really know what it is. Tim has a definition. Tim, do you want to give us the definition that you
Yeah.
say?
So I think the government is saying that conversion therapy is any therapy aimed at changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. It can be changing either way, to gay or to straight or to trans or to non-trans, whatever the right word is for that. I suppose cisgender is the thing. But any therapy aimed at changing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity is deemed conversion therapy in the government's meaning. And by therapy, by the way, I mean, that's not defined really very well, but I mean, by therapy, it could mean a conversation, a private conversation, pastoral care, prayer ministry. Any of these things could be therapy. Don't just think it's professional therapists that they're trying to catch here, although that is a target. Pastoral ministry in general will be deemed to be therapy. In some cases, they're referred to as practices. So
exactly. And here at Christian Concern, we deal very often with organisations that are offering pastoral care, therapeutic help to people who are in all sorts of situations, including people that want to move away from their same-sex attractions. But again, this is what I was wanting to drill us to. In the introduction, the government said there's no justification for these coercive. The government will ban conversion therapy. There is no justification for these coercive and abhorrent practices. And the evidence is clear that it does not work. It does not change a person from being LGBT and cause long-lasting damage to those who... Well, we have to say here that, first of all, anything that is cruel and unkind and abusive and physically harmful is already banned. Anything that is truly coercive and the kind of things that everyone thinks that this might be like electric shock treatment, we know no one that's doing that at all. But the point about it is that's already illegal. When it was practiced, and it was practiced by the medical profession itself, not by anyone that we know that would say they're helping people to move away by choice from unwanted same-sex attractions. The idea that the government is saying in black and white in a consultation that men and women cannot change, it doesn't work. It does not change a person from being LGBT and can cause long-lasting damage. Well, that's clearly disproved by the science. Please go and look at the International Federation for Therapeutic Choice and Counselling. See there a huge scientific memorandum, scientific papers on studies of therapy that's being done with people choosing to move away from sexual practices that they no longer want to be involved in. And you will see there the social science on this.
Yes, and there are lots of people who identify as ex-gay and ex-trans. In fact, we've got some watching now, haven't we? Matthew Grech, I can see, has commented, and he's online. Peter Benjamin is watching online as well. And there are many, many others that we know. I mean, hundreds, even thousands, really, around the world of people who identify as ex-gay and ex-trans. So this idea that you can't change is kind of it's blatantly, falsified by the very existence of people who identify as ex-gay and ex-trans. And in fact, the government even made it a protected term, didn't they, Andrea, in one of our cases? Why don't you talk about that?
Yes, well, the truth is absolutely true that in Mike Davidson, who runs Core Issues Trust, and I and very involved with International Federation for Therapeutic Choice and Counselling, that when Stonewall were putting bus ads out, so you may remember that some of the viewers here today saying now it's just slipped my mind.
Some people are gay, get over it.
Sorry?
Some people are gay, get over
it. Was on the buses, and Mike sort of put out an advert that said ex-gay, post-gay, get over it. Just something that entirely mirrored that. Yeah. Those adverts were withdrawn as being discriminatory, as being offensive, as hurting a certain section of the public. And then what happened in that case, in the jury case, it was determined that ex-gay was in fact a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. So ex-gay is understood and is protected as a sexual orientation within English jurisprudence at this time. I mean, you wouldn't know it for the way in which it plays out, but it's true. That is something that was won in the jurisprudence of that case. I think that case occurred in 2013, so a number of years ago now, but it's held up as good jurisprudence.
Yeah. So, Caris, the point is now then, the government wants to introduce a law, and our position is no new laws are needed. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, the government has been making claims that certain practices, because it actually in the consultation talks about practices of conversion therapy, right? That are practices that are clearly not therapy or counselling, that they are violent and they should be banned. So, for example, there are some cases in different other countries of rape of men targeting women. This is really honour-based violence on the basis of they're perceived to be lesbians, and is kind of trying to change that. And that's obviously a crime anyway, to rape somebody, and is clearly a form of honour-based violence. And then the government has also brought up forced marriage, and there are some cases, again, there was one recently in India of a child, the parents were already trying to force a child to marry somebody they didn't want to, and trying to sign them up for therapy. And so overriding this adult child's ability to make their own choices in life. And clearly those are criminal offences anyway. And the government has, I think, it's been listening to some of what we've said, because we kept on saying it, that they don't need new offences, but they still push, there are elements of the government still pushing the envelope. And I should warn viewers that when you read carefully through the whole consultation, they start by saying coercive conversion therapy. So they assume that every form of therapy or pastoral conversation in a church is coercive, which is wrong. But also when they use the term practices of conversion therapy, they're blurring the line between these things and other things that are not legitimate and criminal or physical. And in laws in other countries like Malta, where there is a ban, a criminal ban, the term used is not conversion therapy, it's conversion practices. So we're already seeing this slide, this slippery slope inside the government consultation documents. And we've got to be pushing back at every step of the way with that and warning what's happened in other countries.
So, and Andrea, they've agreed with us, the government, right, that every physical act that's done in the name of what they call conversion therapy is already a criminal act anyway. So there's no new laws needed there. They've agreed with us on that point, right, which is quite a big thing and a big deal. But then they sort of try and argue that there's something else here that perhaps they need a new law on, called coercive conversion therapy. And they say we need a new law on that. Now, how do you respond to that, Andrea?
Well, I just want to ask, where are the real examples on this? Where is the evidence that this is needed? The reality is this, that therapy is already very highly regulated, so regulated in fact, and the regulatory bodies so influenced by the prevailing narrative that they themselves, in effect, seek to ban therapy for those wanting to move away, who choose to move away from unwanted same-sex attraction. Hence, the media hits and the regulatory monitoring of the licenses of people like Leslie Pilkington, Mike Davidson, and a number of others, in fact, many of which have not seen the light of day. So we already have a situation whereby therapy is so heavily regulated that those that seek to help to move people away from unwanted same-sex attraction, who seek to access that, are already being monitored and targeted and often removed. So we have that situation in effect, that therapy is heavily regulated in this area. The truth is this: even if we move away from this so-called conversion therapy field, therapy is therapy is therapy. We may have bad therapy. Bad therapy is not a good thing. But bad therapy doesn't just apply in the area of conversion therapy or in the area, it applies to every area of therapy. That's why there are regulatory bodies to monitor it. The idea that there is something in this so-called conversion therapy, which is so sinister and so cruel, that isn't already caught by our law and our regulatory framework. So, of course, physical acts of violence, of course, forced, cruel conversion techniques.
But they're already illegal, Andrea. They're already illegal. And the government agrees that.
That's the point. They're already illegal. There's a heavy regulatory framework. So this document, to say that we need something else without giving us really any evidence, any hard evidence of what is already not caught.
I think we ought to realise here that the only verifiable evidence there is in the UK and how this whole campaign started 12 years ago was the work of undercover journalists recording themselves going to see various, always Christian, there were no non-Christian therapists or pastoral counsellors or pastors that they went to see. And they were offended by the words used. And of course, we can have a discussion. It's an entirely legitimate theological and psychological discussion in churches all the time about how we talk with people. That's normal. But it was presented in a completely one-sided manner, in a disingenuous manner, because if you're undercover, you're deceiving the person you're claiming to get help from. And of course, they were not thinking at all about whether there would be other people going to see the same people who might be agreeing with the words used and actively seeking it out for a genuine intrinsic motive. So what does the government? The government has to show us that it has real evidence. Like none of these recordings, none of what was said in these recordings amounted to a criminal offence. It's fairly obvious. Certainly not the physical offence. Not really. Most wouldn't. And you could query some of the words used, and so that's entirely normal part of church discipline, actually, and the exercise of church authority on how we worship and how we address God and do Christian life together.
Yeah. So the interesting point here then is we get to the first important question in the survey in the consultation, having gone through sort of questions about you or questions about your organisation. They asked this first in principle question that says they're seeking views on banning conversion therapy. And the question says, do you agree or disagree that the government should intervene to end conversion therapy in principle? Yeah. That's the question, the very first question. You've got options from strongly agree to strongly disagree or prefer not to say. Now, we're saying that there's no new laws needed here. So our answer is strongly disagree with, in principle, the government intervening. And because also the other aspect is that therapy is really a private conversation and nobody should be intervening in that. The law certainly shouldn't get into it. Yeah. So we're saying strongly disagree in principle with the idea of the government intervening in this whole area. But other people or other organizations are sometimes fudging that or saying maybe there is room here. Why do you think that is, Andrea, perhaps?
Well, I think that perhaps it's hard to know. If I'm absolutely honest, it's quite hard to know because there's an idea that the government will perhaps respect the church's freedom rather than the therapist's freedom. It's the point is these lines are very hard. These lines are very hard to. They shift, and the line between therapy and pastoral work is continually shifts as well. And I think that the notion here that there is anything that is happening that is not already caught by our law or by the regulatory framework. In fact, the regulatory framework takes it so far, very often therapy to help people in this arena is denied to them, and therapists are denied practicing certificates. So the idea that we believe that, or that we as Christians, or that we as Christian organisations might say there is good reason for the government, or there is a reason, or we can neither agree nor disagree about.
Nobody's given an example, have they, Anna? Nobody's given an example of something that isn't a criminal offence and should be.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the real point. Nobody's given us any example of something that isn't a criminal offence now that should be a criminal offence in this whole area. And so we're saying no, that there's no new laws needed. That's the point, isn't it? But Karis, do you have more to say about why we should answer strongly disagree to this point in principle? Should the
Yeah,
government
I think
intervene?
if people think they can concede to the government, I think they need to look a bit wider. Look at internationally, the picture is that when people have tried to concede in other jurisdictions and think, well, of course we wouldn't do, coercive things and we wouldn't these abusive things, then actually the bans have not been stopped. Like in the Australian territories, in Canada, it's still going through the parliament. In Malta, the civil servants were telling them, "Oh, it won't affect you," and then we know what happens: an attack on somebody giving his testimony, on Matthew giving his testimony. So, I think the governments in different places are pulling the wool over people's eyes actually when they are using the word coercion, and they're tricking churches into thinking, yes, of course, we stand for decency and decent behaviour. We would never do that. Not realizing that they are the very target. I think that needs to be said plainly at this stage. And I can say this because I've watched the debate since that Nicolosi conference was infiltrated. I was there in the conference and I was addressed by the person who infiltrated the conference. And I've watched it long before I came to work here. And not everybody was speaking up then. And I know that Christian Concern has a track record that others might not have, not publicly at least. And there is this dual track of attacking churches and attacking therapists and counsellors, and the other side are constantly playing the game of mixing them up.
And the problem is, once you concede that a new law is needed, you're conceding this is a problem, and you're probably opening the gateway to a law that will end up affecting all of us, in some ways.
Yeah.
It's very hard to, define exactly what the law will prohibit and will not prohibit, and it creates.
But I think also you've got to think about the boundaries of what churches are porous. We have different denominations because of history, and of course, churches may have licensed counsellors working on their premises. Churches, of course, hire out their buildings, or maybe hiring a building if they're on a journey going from, an old building they can't use to a new one, or they may be house churches. And so, it's quite simplistic to say, well, just look at how it's affecting churches. Of course, it's necessary and it's good to speak up, but it's always much more than that. It's always about the culture and the social arrangements as well.
And the thing is, as well, once the government's conceded that physical acts are all already illegal, you're coming down to talking acts, aren't you? I mean, that's what it is. And so you whatever you do is bound to breach human rights in some way, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, in some way, is it not, in terms of the government's action on this?
I think you're right. It then gets down to what sort of speech as a society do we allow, and which is partly the discussions about, well, some people have tried to make it a discussion about hate speech and invented the term hate prayer, which is just nonsense. And also I think a lessening, of course, part of the bigger, wider crisis on free speech is the sense by many people that we can't trust people with free speech. We can't really trust civil society and church organizations to solve their problems through debate and discussion, that it has to be done by the criminal law, which is quite an extreme thing to do. Andrea was mentioning regulation therapy. It is regulated, but there are people who would like more regulation in Britain, or more consistent regulation, but that would still fall far short of these criminal provisions. And I think it should be said at this point that therapists have been divided amongst themselves for decades about how to regulate their own profession. I suppose you could compare it to education. You have state education, you have private education, you have homeschool. So there's not any consensus among actual therapists about this, which is why we can also tell that really the real target is churches. Yeah.
So listen, I'm hoping Andrea's coming back on now. Here she is. Okay, so we've covered the question about agreeing with government intervention or not on conversion therapy in principle. The next question about physical acts, and I think we've discussed that because the government agrees that no new laws are needed there, so we agree with them on that. Then you come to the next really important question, which is about what they call talking conversion therapy. And they say there's a gap in the law that means that coercive talking therapy, whatever that means, and that is a problem. What does it mean? Should be banned. And then furthermore, under 18s cannot consent to any form of therapy along these lines, and neither can vulnerable people. So Andrea, talk to us about the implications of all of that.
Well, it's removing, in many ways, parental authority, parental involvement. You could criminalise parents who want to help their child move away, perhaps from some confusion in their lives, to help them to follow a biblical ethic, to help to to help their child in what may well be a very difficult circumstance. The idea that the government intervenes and says that that a child cannot consent to do this kind of therapy is really worrying indeed. It's perhaps
it creates a new legal category, doesn't it, Andrea, of a sort of transgender identifying child that you cannot, you can only affirm their acquired transgender identity. You cannot, on pain of criminal offence, challenge their acquired transgender identity.
Well, I mean, it's almost too fantastical to believe that this is that it's actually.
Don't you believe it, Andrea?
No, I do believe it. It's in black and white, but I mean, I know you can see that. I actually am almost speechless because it's there on the. This is what it means. Do we understand that this is what it means? And do we understand that that cannot be kind and good and right for a child or for a young person that's under the age of 18 is also a radical over interference with parental rights in this arena, with family over interference.
Or teachers, or youth pastors, or pastors.
And also just imagine how they might be caught. I mean, just imagine that. I mean, I can think of a multitude of conversations that I have had over many years with young people in church situations and in non-church situations, where I may well have talked to them about things that they're doing in all sorts of aspects of their life. And, as a Christian in their lives, as very often as someone who's watching over them in a sort of youth leader type of role, in a mentoring role amongst young people, really work with people, taken people to passages in the Bible, sometimes discipline them for behavior that they've been involved in. Those sorts of things would be entirely caught, just normal Christian living, having young people in your home, knowing them over many years, guiding them in life circumstances, having sometimes tough conversations with them. None of those conversations are now safe. They may be deemed to be coercive, cruel upon a vulnerable adult, a lack of regard for really believing that person is who they say they are. Because the other thing that this consultation does is speak big on affirm this continual affirming of this particular identity, and that it is cruel not to affirm someone in their identity. And I think these are things that we need.
Whereas the opposite is true, isn't it? The opposite is true. Yes. James Linton says here it's immoral to enter into the child's delusionary state of gender dysphoria by affirming their belief that they are the opposite sex to which they are immoral. It's actually immoral not to challenge it.
Yeah.
Right. That's actually the case. It is, people have put up here, woe to those who call good evil and evil good. Well, it is like that as well. Isn't it? It's kind of affirming.
And also the language is always it's always used in it's victim language. The government has heard from victims that in recent years, many of those who would previously attempt to change a person's LGBT have conceded that it's not possible. Instead, they may liken feelings of same-sex attraction or being transgender to a defect, deficiency, or addiction, and may conduct conversion therapy in an attempt to remedy or control this. The government considers that in such instances, this would amount to conversion therapy. So, this idea that it's just simply impossible to change, and that it's set, and it's government views that these people are vulnerable, and people under 18 are vulnerable and a higher risk of being harmed. When in fact we know that the good is very often the practices themselves. It's not conversion practices that they're seeking to ban, the harmful thing, as it were. It's actually the homosexual practices themselves. It's staying in lifestyles that very often do not lead to other addictions, lead to other things that really hurt people. Now, if people, the point is here that I haven't ever met a therapist in this field, and I've met many now, who've ever sought to force anyone to continue with therapy, carry on. If people, they often say, if people are happy where they are, in whatever lifestyle they're living.
Therapy only works by consent, doesn't it? It's about, I want to be helped with this, and the therapist agrees to help them with that. You know, that's what it is. It cannot be anything other than consensual. It's always consensual.
Let me say that this is where I find it really sad. I mean, even this week we've been involved in a case that therapy works by consent, and the people that are the wrong end of this are the therapists themselves. So where they get targeted by activists, as we've been experiencing, activists come into the therapeutic room, the safe place, and they say to the therapist who is trusting them that they are genuine. The therapist talks them through the difference that they want in their lives. And they will say things along the lines of, I'm unhappy with my same-sex attraction, I want to diminish it, I'm unhappy in my relationship, it conflicts with my religious conscience. All these sorts of things will be the language that they use. Or I'm addicted to certain behaviors. And the therapist then, dealing with that at face value, seeks to help them as they have requested. And it's then the therapist that's reported to the regulatory body.
Yeah.
So the therapist in the supposed safe place is the one that's being reported. And even this week, we've had a situation whereby a therapist who was targeted, or actually in this case it may not have been targeted exactly, but where a therapist took the person's requests at absolute face value. And for doing that, finds himself hauled before in a secret place before a regulatory body, now in fear of losing his practicing certificate, all behind closed doors. How is that evidence meant to be tested? And if the public at large, and if the laws at large, and if the regulatory profession at large says this person cannot be changed, even if this person says they want to be changed, if that's what we say, then no therapist is safe.
But
Caris,
I want to move on from therapists, because everyone's going to think this is only therapists, and I'm not going to be affected by this. Caris, can you talk about how this could affect churches and church ministry as well?
Okay, so when you look at the consultation document, they talk about protecting prayer. Let me just bring up the text. There's a particular wording. Okay, so this is what they take, and it's actually paragraph 5.2 if people are actually looking at it on the government website. And he said, to be clear, talking conversion therapy could not be reasonably understood to include communications such as casual conversations, exchanges of views, private prayer, or pure speech acts. Now, I don't know what on earth pure speech acts is. It's the sort of thing that a philosopher would say. It's just meaningless waffle. Casual conversation, okay, that's conversation with your friends. Exchange of views, well, that might count. You know, a video like this might count. And then private prayer. Well, what is private prayer? Some churches are house churches. Is that private? And they've moved from being in their public building for one reason or another. But nothing is said to protect public prayer, worship, wedding ceremonies, which, the vows that people take to say, forsaking all others, to help that. Courses, for example, marriage courses, marriage prep, conferences, small groups, anything like that, or preaching or outdoor preaching. And all of these things are not protected. So I don't know why people are going around saying,
or even pastoral care,
prayer,
pastoral care or youth work as well.
Yeah. The list is quite long.
And they're talking about consent forms, aren't they? So under 18s can't consent. So you would be breaking the law by even having the conversation there. And then over 18s can consent. but then they have to sign a consent form. And then, so what are you having to do? Consent forms for every pastoral conversation? I mean, how does this work?
I think the problem is that some people will try and cover their bases with that. The problem is that that's kind of making consent go everywhere in social life, which is a little bit crazy, because we can, in normal life, we sort of, sometimes we know that it's required verbally, like when you sign a work contract or something, or sign, all sorts of, utility bills and things. But there are lots of times when we know from social experience that consent is tacitly given, and that we work on trust. And I think there is a concerted, there is a sort of manipulation of issues around consent here, and there has been amongst our opponents in the last few months. So, for example, Jane Ozanne went before Parliament, I think it was in May, and admitted that nearly everybody, including herself, who went to what she called conversion therapy, had willingly got of their own accord as adults, i.e. they consented. And then the Ozanne Foundation, a month ago, I think it was, brought out this Cooper report where they said people can't give consent. So they're using the kind of, it's interesting because it's kind of the reasoning that was given in the Kira Bell case against the use of puberty blockers. But they didn't cite that. And the reason is that Stonewall is a signatory of the Ozanne Foundation's report. And Stonewall has joined as a third party the legal challenge to the High Court judgment and to the Kira Bell case. And of course, that's going on undoubtedly up the European system as well, because I don't think it's going to stop with our Supreme Court. So they're playing a game with the notion of consent. So who knows what will happen next? But they don't want Orthodox Christians or Orthodox Jews, for that matter, to be able to consent, and anybody to be able to truly consent. So that bringing in forms is bringing in an extra problem. And tell you why also that is, because they will want to use the scientific evidence that they listen to. They won't listen to what the IFTCC will say about the wider scientific evidence, to say, well, you're consenting to being harmed. And you can do that as an adult in the same way as you would consent to sadomasochism, which is basically the gist of the Cooper report when you look at its footnotes.
So I would have to sign a consent form before asking for prayer ministry in church? Is that?
Yes, you might. Yes.
Well, I think that, what will happen in practice is this. I mean, again, that this new legislation generally, what will happen is that many churches and Christians will be put in fear. And what happens with those that are, many Christians are already in fear. And those that are the most will be so fearful of how the government might intervene. They'll place so many hurdles and consent forms and rules around what it means to talk about these things, that the real and pressing needs of a next generation that is sexually confused at all levels, I mean, not just around same-sex and transgenderism, but over porn, the whole sexualization of our youth, that the church will be afraid to speak into one of the most pressing issues of our time, and one of the issues that's really messing up our kids at this time. And the church will be fearful around this because of the eggshells on which it will think it has to work in order to prevent being criminalized in this particular area. So we're already seeing the kind of fear that the church is in and around this. But this will only make it worse.
And Andrea, we're planning a symposium about all the evidence around this. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, we are planning a symposium, and do get in touch with us if you're interested in coming to that. It'll be in central London a week on Tuesday. So do get in touch with us if you'd like to come to that. But we hope there to have a symposium with scientists from the leading scientists in the world who have studied the impact of therapeutic help for those who choose to move away from unwanted sexual behaviours. And they'll look at the evidence around that, the evidence to support whether a conversion therapy ban is necessary, the evidence around the Cooper report. All of this will be looked at a week on Tuesday. So do get in touch with us if you'd like to look at that, to come and be with us there.
Great. Well, look, Karis, the final comment from you before we wrap up?
I think I would encourage supporters to read carefully our guidance and also, yes, come along to vent and do get in touch as well. I think these are times when the envelope is being pushed in lots of different directions, and I think the significance. Not many people don't truly understand the broad significance of this, how it could go. It's not, as you said, it's not going to stop with therapists. The broad implications, as I said, with churches, with public, everything public that churches do actually, or semi-public, be affected.
Well, do look at our guidance. Do please take 30 minutes to just respond to the consultation and follow our guidance to do that. And also encourage your friends, encourage your church leaders, respond on behalf of the church, get your friends to respond as individuals as well. As more responses, the better, particularly responses saying, in principle, we disagree with this whole idea of the government getting involved in this area by the brutal force of law. So do take that action, please. And the closing date is December the 10th on that. So you've got a few weeks now, but it will come quite quickly. And thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. We'll be here again
Can I
next week.
just respond to Mike Feast's comment here? I'm not a trustee of Christian Institute. I work with Colin Hart and Coalition for Marriage. I do oppose a conversion therapy ban, Mike. So I'm with you on that. I absolutely oppose a conversion therapy ban. It's not needed, it's unnecessary, and it's dangerous.
But you're not a trustee.
I'm not a trustee of the conversion therapy. No, I'm not a trustee of the Christian Institute, and I do oppose a conversion therapy ban. Yes,
yeah. So yeah, we've made that clear. Do follow us on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and do sign up for our emails so you can get these action alerts as well, and weekly emails for free. And look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.